The glass was going to shatter. Every senior executive seated around the 50-foot boardroom table at Zenith Holdings had arrived at that collective silent conclusion approximately 4 minutes into Julian Voss's tirade, and none of them had moved so much as a fingertip since. The floor-to-ceiling windows of the 82nd floor offered a sweeping panorama of Silvercrest City's glittering financial district below, but not a single soul in that room dared look at anything except the man at the head of the table or the floor directly in front of their shoes, depending on how much they valued their careers. Julian slammed his palms down on the glass surface again, and this time the entire table shuddered. 12 weeks. His voice had dropped from a roar into something far worse. A low, vibrating growl that seemed to come from somewhere below his chest, somewhere ancient and carnivorous. I gave the acquisitions team 12 weeks to finalize the Meridian contract, and you are standing here in front of me, in suits that cost more than most people's cars, telling me that the deadline was missed because of a scheduling conflict. He let the final 2 words fall out of his mouth, like he was dropping a dead animal onto the table. A scheduling conflict. The VP of Corporate Development, a man named Hartwell, who had survived 3 recessions and 1 hostile board takeover, appeared to be seriously reconsidering every life choice that had led him to this room. Julian straightened to his full, towering height. At 6 feet 5 inches of pure, coiled muscle wrapped in a charcoal 3-piece suit that had been cut specifically to contain him, he did not need to raise his voice to command absolute attention. His dark hair was immaculate. His jaw was set like carved stone, and his eyes, which were ordinarily a deep, focused gray, had developed a faint, burning ring of crimson at the outer edge of each iris, a detail none of his human employees had ever been close enough or brave enough to examine. "You will have the revised proposal on my desk by 6 o'clock this evening," he said, each word clipped and precise. "Every single one of you will cancel whatever plans you have made for tonight. If any of you find that inconvenient, I encourage you to explore the remarkably straightforward process of updating your resume." He picked up his pen from the table. A solid gold instrument, heavy, custom-made, the kind of object that communicated wealth without trying to. He turned it slowly between his fingers. "Are we finished?" Nobody answered. Nobody breathed. Then the door clicked open. It was a small sound, barely audible over the ambient hum of the ventilation system. But Julian's head turned toward it with the instantaneous, locked precision of a predator identifying movement in tall grass. Chloe stepped in. She moved through the wall of collective fear in that boardroom the way someone might walk through a slightly overcrowded elevator, with calm, practiced efficiency and a mild, professional expression that suggested she had somewhere to be and politely intended to get there. Her linen blonde hair was swept back neatly. Her hazel eyes swept the room once, registered the scene with the serene acknowledgement of someone who had witnessed this particular weather pattern many times before. And then she crossed directly to Julian's end of the table. She set a coffee cup down in front of him. A single, precise movement. Half-sweet oat milk latte, extra shot, temperature at exactly 140 degrees, in the matte ceramic cup he preferred over the branded ones the office kitchen stocked. The soft curl of steam rose between them. Something happened to Julian Voss. It was subtle enough that only someone watching very closely would have caught it, and everyone in that boardroom was watching very closely, because their livelihoods depended on reading this man correctly. The tension in his massive shoulders dropped by a fraction. The growl that had been building at the base of his throat stopped as if a switch had been thrown. His eyes, which a moment ago had been somewhere between fury and something older and wilder, refocused. The crimson ring faded. He looked at the cup. He looked at Chloe's retreating back as she turned calmly toward the door. He cleared his throat. Then he sat down, picked up the cup, and took a slow, deliberate sip. His jaw was still set. His expression remained a study in controlled displeasure. But the temperature in the room had dropped by 10 degrees, and every executive present felt it. Hartwell exhaled so quietly it was almost a prayer. 6 o'clock, Julian said again, and this time it was just a directive rather than a sentence from the bench. Go! They went. They went with the coordinated, grateful haste of people who had been unexpectedly pardoned, filing out past Chloe at the door with the kind of relieved, sidelong glances that said they did not understand what had just happened, but they were profoundly grateful that it had. Chloe held the door for the last of them, nodded pleasantly, and closed it behind her. Julian sat alone in the boardroom for exactly 30 seconds, looking at the city below. Then he finished the latte, set the cup down with a controlled click, and walked to his private office. She knocked 4 minutes later. "Come in," he said, not looking up from the contract draft open on his desk. Chloe entered, and Julian cataloged her presence the way he cataloged everything, immediately, completely, involuntarily. The way she walked, the slight unconscious tuck of her chin when she was preparing to say something she expected pushback on, the small white envelope in her hand. He noticed the envelope. Every internal system he possessed went silent. "Mr. Voss," Chloe said, in the calm, professionally warm tone she used for delivering information she had already organized into a tidy mental folder. "I wanted to speak with you directly, rather than routing this through HR." She set the envelope on the edge of his desk. "I'm submitting my formal resignation. 2 weeks' notice, as per my contract terms." Julian did not move. "I've accepted a position at Halcyon Group," she continued, and the name of the rival firm landed somewhere in Julian's chest like a thrown blade. "They offered a 40% salary increase, and the role is a better fit for where I want to take my career. I've already drafted a transition document for whoever takes over my responsibilities, and I'm happy to train my replacement during the notice period." She folded her hands in front of her and looked at him with those hazel eyes, clear and direct and utterly, devastatingly unaware that the man across the desk from her had just experienced something close to a seismic event. Julian held himself perfectly still. Inside the careful architecture of his composure, something enormous and irrational was clawing at the walls. His wolf, the part of him that was 3 years deep into a bone-level, instinct-carved recognition of this woman as his mate, his anchor, the specific human being that his every biological and supernatural imperative had been quietly, furiously, obsessively organizing itself around. That part of him was not processing the words resignation and 2 weeks with anything resembling reason. It was processing them the way fire processes paper. Halcyon Group. She was going to walk across the financial district and sit behind a desk in a building that smelled like someone else's territory and hand her particular brand of quiet, razor-sharp competence to a company that was not his. And he was going to be here, on this floor, drinking coffee, prepared by someone who did not know his temperature preference, and would certainly not walk into a boardroom full of terrified executives with the calm authority of someone who had personally diffused every one of his episodes for 3 years running. The gold pen was in his hand again. He did not remember picking it up. His grip tightened. The pen snapped. It snapped with a clean metallic sound, the two halves separating in his hand like the thing had simply given up. Julian looked at it. He set both pieces down on the desk with great care. He looked back at Chloe, who had glanced at the pen with a brief, unreadable expression, and then returned her eyes to his face. His jaw was tight enough to ache. "The espresso machine," he said. Chloe blinked. "I'm sorry?" "The imported unit. The one in the executive kitchen. The one that took facilities 4 months to source from overseas and cost more than the average person earns in 2 years. Julian leaned back in his chair with the deliberate, controlled ease of a man who had definitely not just snapped a solid gold pen with his bare hand. "You spent the better part of 6 months learning to operate it correctly. You only recently stopped producing coffee that tasted like it had been filtered through despair." Chloe stared at him. "I don't have time to train a new assistant," he continued, and his voice had taken on the particular, clipped tone he used when delivering pronouncements that he considered self-evidently logical and was not open to debating. "The onboarding process alone would cost the company more in lost productivity than whatever Halcyon is dangling at you. It's a straightforward cost-benefit analysis." "Mr. Voss," Chloe said, slowly, Are you saying that the reason I shouldn't leave is because of a coffee machine? I'm saying your salary is doubled, effective immediately. Return to your desk." The silence that followed had a particular quality to it. The kind of silence that happens when a sentence lands in a room and the room takes a moment to figure out what to do with it. Chloe's expression cycled through several careful transitions. Surprise. Calculation. The particular sharp-eyed focus she got when numbers were rearranging themselves in her head. You're doubling my salary. I don't repeat myself. That's more than the halcyon offer. I would hope so. I'm not running a charity. She looked at him for a long moment. Julian held her gaze with the flat, impassive expression of a man who had made a perfectly reasonable business decision and was waiting for it to be acknowledged as such, while internally he was sitting on top of approximately 400 pounds of feral instinct that was advocating for significantly less subtle methods of ensuring she stayed in this building. I would need it in writing, Chloe said finally. Obviously. And I want the title change that was supposed to happen 8 months ago. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker so brief it was barely a flicker. Fine. And I'm not working past 8 on Thursdays anymore. I have a pottery class. Julian looked at her as if she had just announced she commuted to work via hot air balloon. A pottery class. It reduces stress. She tilted her head slightly. You might consider looking into it. His eyes narrowed by a precise, dangerous degree. Chloe held his gaze without flinching. She had been doing that since her first week, back when the rest of his staff had still been actively afraid to knock on his office door without first confirming his schedule with 2 separate people and checking the ambient tension level in the executive suite. She had knocked on that door on her 3rd day, handed him a reorganized filing system she had built over a weekend, because the old one made no sense, and told him it would save him approximately 4 hours a week. He had stared at her for long enough that she had mentally rehearsed her graceful exit from the building. Then he had taken the files and told her she was blocking his light. She had understood that as a thank you and had never mentioned it again. That had been 3 years ago. Fine, Julian said again, each letter bitten off with restrained precision. No work past 8 on Thursdays. It's a negligible scheduling adjustment. Chloe picked up the white envelope from the edge of his desk. She held it for a moment, and something in her expression softened almost imperceptibly. The slight easing of someone who had steeled themselves for a fight and found unexpected ground. I'll shred this, she said. That would be efficient. She turned toward the door. Chloe! She stopped, looked back at him over her shoulder. Julian was already looking at the documents on his desk again. Pen, a different one, retrieved from the drawer, held in one hand with studied nonchalance. His profile was sharp and unreadable against the floor-to-ceiling glass and the sprawling, glittering architecture of Silvercrest City behind him. The morning briefing is at 7:30 tomorrow, he said. Don't be late. I'm never late, she said. Then continue the trend. She left. The door closed behind her with a quiet, decisive click. Julian sat motionless for a moment in the empty office. Then he opened his desk drawer and placed the 2 halves of the broken gold pen inside it with the careful, controlled movement of a man who was absolutely, completely fine and not in any way conducting emergency internal structural maintenance on his composure. He pulled the new contract amendment template up on his screen and began typing before the words had finished forming in his mind. The salary figure he entered so far above what anyone in her position would expect that his head of HR was going to have questions. He would handle that. He would tell them it was a retention incentive. He would cite market competitiveness and strategic operational value. He would say whatever needed to be said in the cool, authoritative, entirely unassailable language of sound business logic. Outside his office, he could hear the faint sound of her chair rolling back to her desk, the specific familiar rhythm of her keyboard, the soft sound of her setting a fresh cup of something down on the corner of her workspace. The knot between his shoulder blades loosened by exactly 1 degree. Julian Voss, Alpha King of the Silvercrest region, supreme authority over 6 shifter syndicates, and the iron-fisted CEO of a financial empire with holdings on 3 continents, adjusted his cufflink, squared the documents on his desk, and went back to work. He did not smile. He absolutely did not smile. The raise was, by any objective measure, extraordinary. Chloe had run the numbers 3 times on the evening of the first day. Sitting at her kitchen table in her apartment in the Voss-owned residential tower, 2 blocks from the office. A coincidence she had never examined too closely, with a glass of wine and the revised contract printed in front of her. She had run them again the next morning, with coffee. The figure was the same both times. It was, factually, more money than she had expected to earn for another 5 or 6 years, and it had been handed to her by a man whose stated reason for doing so was that she had learned to operate a coffee machine. She was not naive. She was also, however, pragmatic, and pragmatism required her to acknowledge that whatever Julian Voss's actual motives were, overinflated attachment to operational continuity, some eccentric CEO logic she didn't have the clearance to access, or simply the reflexive territorial instinct of a man who disliked being told no, the number on that contract was real. The title change was real. The Thursday pottery exemption, which she had obtained with a boldness she was still mildly impressed by, was in writing. She had stayed. But she was not an idiot. Staying did not mean stopping. It meant recalibrating. The raise had closed the immediate financial gap. But Chloe was 24 years old with a 5-year career plan that she updated every 6 months in a color-coded document. And that document had always included a line item that read, "Explore lateral growth opportunities." Working as a personal executive assistant to a man who communicated primarily through controlled glares and strategically deployed silence was not, technically, a trajectory. It was a holding position. So she updated her profile on the professional network sites. She reached out to a few recruiters, quietly, the way you might test the temperature of water before stepping in. She scheduled a coffee meeting with a talent acquisition specialist from Orion Capital, one of the mid-tier financial groups with offices in the northern end of Silvercrest City's Central District. The coffee meeting went well. The recruiter was enthusiastic. Orion Capital extended a formal interview invitation for a director-level position within the week. Orion Capital was acquired by Zenith Holdings 11 days later. The announcement came through the Silvercrest Financial Wire at 6 in the morning. Chloe read it on her phone while waiting for the subway and experienced a sensation that she could only describe as a long, slow blink of the brain. She checked the date on the acquisition announcement. She checked the date of her interview invitation. She set her phone down. She picked it up again. It was a coincidence. It had to be a coincidence. Zenith Holdings operated across multiple sectors and acquired companies with the casual regularity of other people buying groceries. The timing was, admittedly, striking. But the world was full of striking coincidences. She was not the kind of person who pattern-matched herself into the center of events that had nothing to do with her. She went to work. She said nothing. Julian sat at his desk looking exactly like a man who had not just annexed an entire mid-tier financial group and was completely indifferent to her existence, which was his default setting, so there was nothing to read into. She let it go. She scheduled an interview with Vertex Asset Management. Vertex was absorbed into the Zenith Holdings portfolio 48 hours after her interview confirmation email arrived. Chloe stared at the acquisition notice for a very long time. Then she opened a new browser tab, scrolled through 3 pages of Silvercrest's financial sector listings, and sent her resume to Pinnacle Strategies, a boutique consulting firm that was privately held, founder-operated, and had 0 prior intersection with anything Julian Voss had ever touched. She booked the interview for a Thursday afternoon, which meant she could leave at 8 sharp using the pottery exemption as legitimate cover, and she told absolutely no one. She arrived at Pinnacle Strategies offices in a building she had never been to, rode the elevator to the 14th floor, was greeted by a pleasant receptionist, and was shown to a small, glass-walled conference room where the lead interviewer would be with her momentarily. She sat down, she smoothed her jacket, She arranged her portfolio on the table in front of her. The door opened. Julian Voss folded himself into the interviewer's chair across from her with the deliberate, unhurried ease of a man who had choreographed this exact moment and was finding it satisfactory. He was in a different suit than the one he'd been wearing that morning, charcoal with a faint chalk stripe, which meant he had gone home and changed, which meant he had planned this far enough in advance to account for logistics, which meant a great many things that Chloe was rapidly and furiously processing behind a facial expression she was working very hard to keep neutral. He placed a slim folder on the table. He looked at her with the expression of a man experiencing mild, polite professional interest, the way you might look at a contract term you found slightly beneath your time. "Regrettably," Julian said, "the company you are applying to just became a subsidiary of my empire." The silence lasted approximately 4 seconds. "No," Chloe said. "Yes. You bought Pinnacle Strategies." "I acquire companies constantly. It is the nature of my business. You bought Pinnacle Strategies in the last 4 hours. The timeline of a transaction is rarely linear." He tilted his head by a fraction of a degree. "Go back to the office and make my coffee. Now." Chloe looked at him. She looked at the folder on the table, which she strongly suspected contained an actual acquisition document, because Julian Voss was exactly the kind of man who brought props to a confrontation. She looked at the glass wall of the conference room, beyond which the pleasant receptionist was now intently examining something on her computer screen with the focused attention of a person who had been very recently instructed not to make eye contact with the conference room. "This is," Chloe said, choosing her words the way someone picks their footing on a sea ground, "a significant use of resources to solve a very small problem." "You are not a small problem." The sentence dropped between them, and Julian appeared to hear it landing half a second after it left his mouth. Something flickered across his expression. He straightened slightly and redirected his gaze to the middle distance with the practiced ease of a man conducting a rapid revision. "Administrative gaps are not small problems," he said. "Your replacement would require 6 to 8 months to reach operational competence. The cost-benefit analysis is unambiguous." He stood. He adjusted his cuff. "The car is outside." There was, in fact, a car outside. There was always a car now. That particular development had begun 2 weeks earlier, on a morning when Chloe had arrived 3 minutes past her usual time, damp from a platform delay that had added 20 minutes to her commute and sent her schedule cascading in a way that Julian had apparently noted with the intensity of a man monitoring critical infrastructure. She had not even finished hanging up her coat before his office door had opened. "You were 3 minutes late," Julian had said, from his doorway, with the tone of someone announcing a structural failure. "The transit system was delayed. There was a signal issue at the—" "I cannot tolerate my executive schedule being delayed by public transit," he said. "It's an inefficiency." He had gone back into his office. He had closed the door. The next morning, there had been a car outside her apartment building. Long, matte black, engine so quiet it might have been running on principle alone. The driver had been standing beside it, holding a card with her name on it, as though he had been there for some time and expected to be there every day going forward. Chloe had called Julian's direct line. It had rung twice. "What?" he had said. "There is a car outside my building." "I'm aware. You sent a car to my building." "I contracted a private transport service for senior executive staff. It's a standard retention measure. Stop making it remarkable." A pause. "The morning briefing is in 40 minutes. Don't stand on the pavement analyzing it." She had gotten into the car. It had arrived at the office with 9 minutes to spare. The interior had smelled faintly of cedar and whatever extraordinarily expensive leather Zenith Holdings apparently specified when commissioning luxury hypercars for a senior executive staff that consisted, as far as Chloe could determine, entirely of her. She had said nothing else about it. The car came every morning. She got in. She arrived on time. Julian received this development with the total indifference of a man whose schedule was proceeding as designed and who had no further thoughts on the matter. The coat had been a separate incident. Chloe had been burning through a reporting cycle that had stretched into the late evening, the kind of night where the building gradually empties and the office takes on the particular pressurized quiet of a place that is pretending not to exist. She had been at her desk at 11:47, cross-referencing 2 spreadsheets and drinking cold coffee, and at some point between the 3rd and 4th hour of that, she had simply put her head down, just for a moment, to rest her eyes. She woke up warm. There was something draped over her shoulders and back, heavy and soft, smelling very strongly of something that her half-conscious brain identified as clean wool and cedar and something else. Something that her nervous system apparently had opinions about, because she became aware of a slow, very specific feeling of calm that had no logical justification. She blinked. She raised her head. Julian was sitting at his desk. He was reviewing a document. He had not looked up. She looked down at the coat covering her. It was clearly his. The fabric alone probably cost more than her first month's rent. A deep charcoal wool that had been tailored to fit a man roughly the size of a structural column. It was draped over her with a precision that suggested it had been placed rather than dropped. His eyes moved from his document to her face with the deliberate velocity of something being carefully controlled. "Don't flatter yourself," Julian said before she could speak. His voice was its usual flat, uninflected register. "I don't want you getting sick and passing your workload to someone else. The timing would be inconvenient." Chloe looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," she said. His jaw moved slightly. "Go home. You're not being paid overtime to sleep in my office. Technically, given my new salary, I think I am." His expression did not change, but something behind it shifted. A fractional, involuntary adjustment around his eyes that she had started to notice. The way you start to notice a pattern in what you thought was a random texture. She had cataloged several of these in recent weeks. The way his shoulders dropped by a barely perceptible degree when she walked into a room. The way his speech, which was normally clipped to the point of being architectural, would occasionally acquire an extra word or clause when directed at her, as though some part of him was stalling for time. She was probably misreading it. He was famously difficult to read. Entire departments had been restructured based on misreadings of Julian Voss's expression. She folded the coat neatly and set it on the arm of his office couch on her way out. He did not tell her to keep it. She did not expect him to. She thought about it on the ride home in the silent, cedar-scented car, watching Silvercrest City's lights scroll past the window. She thought about 3 acquired companies and 1 coat, about a salary that defied logic, and a chauffeur who already knew her morning schedule, about a man who spoke exclusively in the language of operational efficiency, and had not, in 3 years, said a single honest thing about any of it. She was, as she had established, not an idiot. But she was also employed, transported, occasionally kept warm, and in possession of a Thursday evening that belonged entirely to Clay and a pottery wheel, which was more than she'd had before the white envelope. She would keep collecting data. In the morning, she would make his coffee and put it on his desk and watch his jaw unclench by 4 degrees. And she would file that data point alongside all the others, in a folder she hadn't labeled yet, in the back of her mind where she kept the things she wasn't ready to name. The car slid silently through the glittering arteries of Silvercrest City, carrying her home. It started as an ordinary Tuesday. Chloe had stayed late finishing the quarterly briefing documents that Julian had needed by morning, and by the time she had saved the final version and powered down her second monitor, the building had thinned to its skeleton crew. The cleaning staff moved quietly through the corridors. The executive floor was still, lit by the ambient glow of the Silvercrest City skyline pressing through the floor-to-ceiling glass. She had told her driver not to wait. It had seemed wasteful, sitting at her desk with 2 hours of work in front of her, while a man idled in a luxury hypercar 60 stories below, and she had the transit card in her bag, and the late trains were never crowded. She had sent a brief message and told him she would manage. Julian had not been in his office when she left. Or rather, the light under his door had been off, which she had taken as evidence of absence, because Julian Voss did not sit in the dark. Julian Voss operated in carefully controlled, precisely calibrated environments, and darkness was not one of them. She took the service elevator to the underground parking structure to retrieve the folder she had left in the building's secure mailroom, which connected through level 2. Her heels were quiet on the painted concrete. The overhead fluorescents hummed with a slightly sickly frequency of lights that needed replacing, casting the space in a pale, flat yellow that made everything look like a photograph taken a long time ago. She noticed them because of the stillness. People move through parking garages with purpose. They are transitional spaces, not places anyone lingers. But the 3 men standing near the support pillar at the far end of level 2 were not moving toward a vehicle. They were not on their phones. They were not doing anything at all, except standing in the particular configuration of people who have arranged themselves around a fixed point and are waiting for it to come to them. Chloe slowed her pace by a half step. Her brain began the quiet, rapid assessment it performed in situations that didn't add up. 3 men, no vehicles nearby with active key fobs, no business attire. The larger one on the left had something heavy in his jacket pocket that pulled the fabric wrong. She turned casually toward the mailroom door. Miss Brennan, her name, in a stranger's voice, in a parking garage at 11:30 at night. She stopped, turned. The one who had spoken was the shortest of the 3, which still put him at roughly 6 feet, with a face that had been rearranged at some point by something hard. He had the flat, measured tone of someone who had rehearsed this conversation and found it straightforward. "We just need a few minutes of your time," he said. "I don't have a few minutes," she said, with a steadiness that her body was not entirely aligned with. Her hand had found her phone in her bag. "You have access to Julian Voss's private files, his acquisition roadmaps, his shell company frameworks, his regional syndicate records." The man took a step forward. The configuration shifted. "You're going to want to be cooperative about this." The word syndicate landed strangely. She shelved it. "I'm a personal executive assistant," Chloe said. "I manage his calendar and his correspondence and his coffee. I don't have access to anything you'd want." "You'd be surprised what we want." The large one on the left moved first, and he moved faster than a man that size had any business moving, and suddenly the concrete pillar was at her back, and a hand had closed around her upper arm with a grip that was not asking. Chloe's phone was halfway out of her bag. The fluorescent lights buzzed. Somewhere deeper in the structure, a pipe knocked against its housing. Then the stairwell door opened. The sound it made was not the sound of a door being opened. It was the sound of a door being moved aside by something that had run out of patience for physical obstacles. The metal handle left a dent in the adjacent wall that Chloe would later be told by the structural assessor contracted to evaluate the damage should not have been possible for a single person to produce. Julian Voss stepped into the parking garage. He was still in his suit. The 3-piece charcoal chalk stripe from the office, jacket still buttoned, pocket square still precisely folded. His dark hair was exactly as it had been at 9 o'clock that morning. His cufflinks caught the fluorescent light. He looked, from the shoulders up, like a man who had come to collect something and was mildly inconvenienced by the weight. Everything below the surface of that picture was something else, entirely. Chloe had seen Julian move through spaces before, the boardroom, the corridor, the way he crossed his office with the ground-eating stride of a man for whom rooms were always slightly too small. She had never seen him like this. He crossed the parking level in 12 steps that she found herself counting without meaning to, each one hitting the concrete with a controlled weight that was somehow louder than it should have been. And his eyes, locked onto the 3 men in front of him, were the color of an overcast sky right before something catastrophic. "Let go of her arm," Julian said. His voice was absolutely level, the way a bridge is level in the 3 seconds before the support structure fails. The large man did not let go of her arm. He turned to face Julian with the practiced confidence of someone who had assessed the situation and arrived at conclusions that were going to end badly for him. What happened next occurred in a compressed burst of time that Chloe's brain received in pieces rather than sequence. Julian moved. She had no better word for it. He did not stride or lunge. He crossed the intervening space with a velocity that her nervous system flagged as information it did not know how to file. And the large man's grip on her arm simply ceased, because the large man was no longer in a position to maintain a grip on anything. Having encountered Julian Voss's fist with the full and catastrophic force of whatever physics were in operation in that man's body. The sound was concrete. The large man hit the ground in a way that suggested he would be there for a while. The second one came from Chloe's left with a blade, a long, ugly thing that had been retrieved from somewhere in his jacket. He led with speed, and the angle was bad, coming in low and across, and Julian stepped into it rather than away from it with the exact wrong calculation that turned out to be entirely intentional. Because his forearm intercepted the arc and the blade opened a line across it, and Julian did not make a sound. Not a flinch. Not a breath. He used the momentum of the man's swing to drive him face first into the support pillar, and the pillar won, and the blade skittered across the concrete floor in a metallic whisper. Blood soaked through the white cuff of Julian's dress shirt in a dark, spreading bloom. He did not look at it. He did not adjust his grip. His face was set in something that was not anger, exactly, but was so far past anger on a spectrum she had no coordinates for that she had no language to describe it. The third man, the one who had spoken her name, produced something from his jacket that was heavier than a blade and pointed it at Julian with both hands. Julian turned to look at it, then at the man holding it. His expression acquired a quality of exhausted, contemptuous patience. He crossed the distance faster than the man's finger found the trigger, and after that, the specifics of what happened were a sequence of sounds and impacts that resulted in the firearm being elsewhere. Two of the man's fingers at angles they were not designed to achieve, and the man himself joining his companions on the parking garage floor. It had taken, Chloe estimated, approximately 45 seconds. Julian straightened. He adjusted his jacket collar with the automatic, habitual gesture of a man who had just held a door open, rather than dismantled 3 armed professionals. He turned toward her. "Are you—" The piece of glass was from the one car in her section, a vehicle whose window had been pressurized by the impact against the pillar and had shed a shard onto the concrete in a place Chloe had not tracked because she had been watching Julian, which was the only reason she stepped on it rather than around it. It was a small thing, no longer than her fingernail, and it caught the edge of her palm as she instinctively put her hand out against the pillar for balance, and it opened a thin, shallow cut across the heel of her hand that welled immediately with red. She looked at it. It stung in the sharp, bright, clarifying way of small cuts. "Oh," she said, mildly, "the way you react to things that are more surprising than serious." Julian went absolutely still. The kind of still that is not calm, but is instead the compression before detonation, the held breath of a pressure system reaching its threshold. He was looking at her hand. She watched, with an attention that was becoming something closer to alarm, as something traveled through his body from the ground up. A change in his posture that was not a posture change. It was a change in the quality of space around him, the way the air before a lightning strike carries a different charge. His shoulders expanded. His head dropped a fraction, and in the flat fluorescent light of the parking garage, she watched his eyes, which had been that gray sky pre-storm color since he'd walked in, burn through it to something else entirely. A deep, furious, violent crimson, lit from within like something biological had seized control of the circuitry. The sound he made was not a human sound. It was low and guttural, and it did not come from his throat so much as from his chest, from something older and larger that his chest was containing, through an effort visible in every corded line of his frame. It was a sound that did not belong in a building, or a parking garage, or a city. It was a sound that belonged in dark places, in old stories about things that moved through forests and did not leave tracks that anyone who found them could explain. It rattled the corroded pipes above them. Chloe felt it in her sternum. The 2 men on the floor, who were still conscious, heard it and became very, very interested in being completely motionless. Julian's gaze moved from her hand to the men on the ground, with the specific, locked-on velocity of a targeting system that had just updated its parameters, and the crimson in his eyes did not waver. His jaw was tight enough that the muscle in his cheek had become a visible, rigid line. His hands, hanging at his sides, had curled into fists so compressed that his knuckles had moved through white into something bloodless and absolute. The blood from the slash on his forearm was dripping quietly onto the concrete beside his shoe. He did not appear to notice it. Chloe pressed her back against the pillar, not in a way she had decided on, but in the way your body makes decisions when your brain is occupied with processing something that does not have an existing file. Every hair on her arms had risen. Something deep and primitive in her nervous system, something that predated language and logic and 5-year career plans, had received a transmission from the man in front of her and was responding with a single, clarifying signal. She was not afraid of him. She understood, in the same breath, why everyone else was. He had not moved. He was still standing between her and the men on the ground, between her and the exit, between her and whatever had come through that door 45 seconds ago, looking for her name. The crimson in his eyes burned steady and absolute, locked on threats she could no longer see because he was in the way, and his stillness was not the stillness of a man who had finished. It was the stillness of something that had not yet decided it was finished. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, indifferent and thin. Chloe realized she was holding her breath. She released it carefully. "Julian," she said, his name in her voice, in that concrete space. His head turned toward her, slow and precise, the crimson gaze moving from the threats on the ground to her face. And there it was again. That thing she had been filing in the unlabeled folder. That fractional, involuntary shift. Not gone, not softened, but redirected. The terrible focus of him landing on her face and doing something there that it had not done anywhere else in the last 45 seconds. The growl in his chest did not stop, but it changed frequency. Barely. The way a frequency changes when it finds a resonance rather than an obstruction. She was still pressed against the pillar. Her hand still bled quietly against her palm. The cut was minor. Everything about this situation was not. She looked at him, at the crimson burning in his eyes, at the blood soaking through his white cuff, at the absolute, unmanageable force of him filling the space between her and the rest of the world. And she thought about 3 acquired companies and 1 coat, about a car that appeared overnight and a salary that had no justification, about the way his shoulders always dropped by a fraction when she walked into a room, about the word syndicate, dropped so casually by a man who was currently on the parking garage floor. She was, as established, not an idiot. She was also beginning to understand that the folder in the back of her mind, the one she hadn't labeled, had been waiting for exactly this data point to tell her what it contained. He had not taken her to a hospital. She had not, in the immediate aftermath, been in a state to argue about this. The car, a different one, blacked out and silent, which had appeared in the parking garage with a driver who had clearly been summoned before Julian had even finished dealing with the last man on the floor, had moved through Silvercrest City with the quiet urgency of something operating outside normal traffic patterns, and Julian had sat beside her in the back seat, saying nothing. His gashed forearm resting across his knee, his jacket now draped over her shoulders, because her hands had been shaking, and he had noticed before she had. His penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of a residential tower in the Northern Financial District, the kind of address that existed in Silvercrest City's geography the way landmarks did, as orientation points, not places where people actually lived. The elevator opened directly into a private foyer, and from there, into a main space that was vast and spare, and furnished with the deliberate restraint of enormous wealth. All dark wood and clean lines and floor-to-ceiling glass offering the city below like a painting of itself. There was a first aid kit in the bathroom cabinet. She found it while Julian sat on the edge of the low sofa with his jacket off and his sleeve rolled back, examining his own forearm with the detached, clinical interest of a man assessing a technical problem. The cut was deep and long, running diagonally from just below his elbow, and it had soaked through the white cuff entirely. A human being with that wound should have been pale and shaky. Julian looked like a man who had gotten ink on his shirt. She sat down across from him and opened the kit. Her hands were still not entirely steady. She had managed to get them under control in the car by pressing them flat against her knees and concentrating on the city lights outside the window. But now, in the close and quiet of his private space, with the reality of the evening pressing back in. The steadiness was approximate at best. She cleaned the wound with the antiseptic from the kit and did not look at his face while she did it. He did not make a sound. "This needs stitches," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "It will be fine." She looked up at that. He met her eyes steadily, the crimson from the parking garage fully gone now, his irises their usual deep, stormy gray, and he looked so precisely like the controlled, impassive man she had spent 3 years decoding across an office desk that something in her chest clenched tightly and then broke open. "What are you?" Her voice cracked on the last word. Not a question exactly, or not only a question. An accusation. A plea. A demand issued by a person who had been holding a great deal of information in an unlabeled folder for a very long time and was now watching that folder fall open whether she was ready or not. Julian was quiet. "Those men said syndicate," she continued, and her eyes were burning now, which she resented fiercely. She was not a person who cried. She was practical and organized, and she managed her emotional responses the way she managed her calendar. But there was apparently a threshold, and the threshold was watching a man take a blade to the arm without flinching and then produce a sound in a parking garage that had rattled the pipes in her ribcage. "They came looking for you. Through me, and you walked through a metal door, and you broke 3 armed men in 45 seconds, Julian. And your eyes." She stopped, pressed her lips together. "What are you?" He looked at her hands, wrapped around his forearm with the gauze half secured. Her knuckles whitened with the effort of holding herself together. He looked at her face. He looked at the small bandage on her palm, the one covering the shallow scratch from the shard of glass, which was so minor compared to the gash she was currently trying to close that it should not have registered in any rational hierarchy of events. His jaw moved. Something traveled through the enormous frame of him, something she recognized now as the visible edge of what he kept below the surface, the thing she had been catching in fractions for 3 years, the shoulder drop, the redirected focus, the extra word in a sentence that had no operational justification. "You were never just a damn employee, Chloe." His voice was not the boardroom voice. It was not the voice that had ended careers and terminated contracts and delivered salary doublings in the tone of a man discussing weather patterns. It was something beneath all of those voices, rougher and lower, and stripped of every layer of architecture he had spent years building over it. He moved, and she did not startle, because some part of her had known. He pulled her against his chest with the careful force of a man who was being gentle on purpose, the way very strong things are gentle on purpose, and she found herself with her face against the crisp remnant of his white dress shirt, her hands pressed between them, his massive arms enclosing her with the specific, complete quality of something that had been waiting for exactly this and did not intend to be interrupted. His frame shook. That was the detail that undid her. Not the strength of him, not the size, not the way the space in the room reorganized itself around him. The shaking, the barely perceptible tremor running through all that muscle and composure and carefully maintained arrogance, the seismic acknowledgement of something that had been held too long. "You are my fated mate." The words came out low and unsteady, and nothing like anything Julian Voss had ever said in her presence. "I knew it 3 years ago. The first day you walked into my office with a reorganized filing system and told me I was blocking your light." A breath. "I bought those companies. I raised your salary. I sent the car and the coat, and I tolerated 3 years of you misfiling the Meridian correspondence because the thought of you walking out of that door," his arms tightened almost imperceptibly, "it kills me. Every single time." She was crying. She had lost the argument with herself about that. She pressed her face harder into his chest and let it happen. Because the folder was fully open now, and everything in it was the same thing written in different languages. The snapped pen, the broken companies, the coffee temperature he had never once told her, he knew exactly. 3 years of a man building walls around himself and building everything else around her, and thinking, apparently, that she wouldn't notice, that she would keep showing up and leaving and not connecting the evidence mounting in that unlabeled place in her mind. She was not an idiot. She had just been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, for the word for what she already knew. She pulled back just far enough to look at him. His face, the sharp features, and the dark hair, and the jaw that was always tight with the effort of containing himself, was closer than it had ever been, and his eyes were watching her with an expression so undefended it was almost difficult to look at directly, the way you don't look directly at the sun. Her hands moved before her brain completed the sentence. She found the length of his silk tie, still knotted with the habitual precision of a man who had dressed for a normal Tuesday morning, and she closed her fingers around it and pulled. He came down to her. She kissed him with the accumulated weight of 3 years and 1 parking garage and every small datum in the folder she hadn't known she was keeping. And he made a sound against her mouth that was nothing like the growl in the garage. It was low and undone and entirely human, and she felt it in her teeth. And then, whatever remained of his restraint made its final, unceremonious departure. He lifted her onto the desk. The massive mahogany executive desk that dominated the center of his penthouse office space, the one she had delivered approximately 900 documents to over 3 years and had never sat on, now bore her weight with his hands at her waist and his dark eyes inches from hers, and the controlled composure of Julian Voss, CEO and alpha king and tsundere billionaire, was thoroughly, finally, irretrievably gone. Something in the air of the penthouse had changed. Warmer, somehow, heavier. She could feel it on her skin, the presence of him, the way the space around him had always seemed marginally different from regular space. And she understood now what that was. The wolf, the part of him that had been sitting behind those gray eyes for 3 years, conducting an extremely patient and increasingly unhinged campaign of corporate devotion, was not behind anything anymore. His hands in her hair were careful and not careful. His voice, when he spoke against the curve of her temple, had finally stopped performing. "Mine," he said, which under any other circumstances, and from any other man, she would have had a great deal to say about. From him, in that moment, it landed somewhere below language and settled there like something always meant to exist in that exact place. She decided she could discuss the semantics later. 3 months is a short time in the life of a city. Silvercrest City did not particularly notice. The financial markets opened and closed. The Central District moved its money between buildings. Zenith Holdings continued its relentless expansion because Julian Voss did not stop being the ruthless, territorial, impeccably suited engine of an empire simply because he had stopped pretending he had no feelings. If anything, he was more focused. Chloe had decided this was because he was no longer expending approximately 40% of his processing capacity on elaborate corporate theater designed to keep one human woman from updating her resume, and she felt comfortable saying this to his face now, which produced the expression she had privately filed as his genuine version of amusement. The jaw still tight, the eyes still sharp, but something unlocked at the corners of his mouth that she was apparently one of very few people on Earth permitted to cause. She had her title. She had her Thursday evenings. She had the car, which she had eventually accepted she was keeping, and a ceramic mug on her desk with her name on it that had appeared one morning without comment, and that Julian, when asked, had attributed to an inventory rebalancing in the executive kitchen. She had also, at a small and private ceremony on a rooftop in Silvercrest City, with approximately 12 witnesses, and a wolf pack elder she had been told was simply an old family friend, acquired a set of rings and a mate bond that her entire nervous system had confirmed on a level well below the reach of paperwork. She had thought sometimes in the weeks after the parking garage and the penthouse and the desk that was now permanently associated in her mind with events she did not discuss during business hours, about the ordinary logic that had carried her through the last 3 years. The pragmatism, the 5-year plan and the color-coded document, and the sensible, grounded way she had moved through a world that had been extraordinary the entire time, just waiting for her to look directly at it. She did not regret the pragmatism. It had kept her employed. And being employed by Julian Voss had turned out to be the most consequential decision of her life, which was the kind of retrospective that took some sitting with. What she thought, when she thought about all of it, was this: the fiercest things hide best. They have to. They have the most to lose. She was in the kitchen of the penthouse on a Thursday morning, her pottery class notes on the counter, when she sent him a text about lunch. A simple one. Something from the place on the corner of the financial district that he would never admit to enjoying and always finished completely. 62 floors below her, Julian Voss was dismantling an executive team that had failed to anticipate a competitor's quarterly move. His voice at the controlled, flat temperature that made grown adults reconsider their life choices. His shoulders filling the head of the boardroom table with the implacable authority of a man who ran a great deal more than just the room he was standing in. His phone lit up on the table beside him. He glanced at it. Something happened to his face. It was brief. If you had blinked, you would have missed it. A break in the architecture. A fracture so complete and unguarded that every executive present witnessed it and then immediately looked somewhere else. Because some things are private, even in a boardroom. And a man like Julian Voss smiling at his phone was one of them. The smile carried the wedding ring into the light for exactly 3 seconds before he set the phone face down, cleared his throat, and returned to the quarterly review with his usual expression of devastating, controlled displeasure. No one said a word. No one ever did. If you enjoyed this Billionaire Shifter romance audiobook, please hit the like button and subscribe for more epic stories.